We start the second conference day with a keynote lecture by Professor Myroslav Shkandrij, who is the professor at the University of Manitoba and the author of Jews in Ukrainian literature, representation and identity, published by Yale University Press 10 years ago. And this book was recently translated and published in Ukrainian. Okay, so I'm so pleased to welcome you, Myroslav. So we have about 45 minutes for presentation, and then we have questions.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I've been asked to speak in English, which I will try to do. My presentation is really about the difficulty of telling a complex and enduring discourse, the discourse around Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine. It's a very important one, it's a complex one, and it's been often a controversial one. But it's very valuable to assess this, because many current approaches to cultural history, to literature, can be applied. This discourse can be very fruitfully examined through contemporary approaches like post-colonial studies, conflict studies, cultural memory studies, as we heard yesterday from Amelia Glaser, transnational culture, comparative genocide. There's a lot of very interesting material here. One of the most difficult aspects of this I have found, and this is what I want to speak about, is the difficulty of combining different mono-narratives or different settled points of view. The need to tell a story that incorporates another person's or another group's story. One has to sort of illuminate and describe from two perspectives or more simultaneously. I began thinking about this when I wrote the book on Jews in Ukrainian literature. I've also had to think about this working on an exhibition of Ukrainian and Jewish relations, cultural relations in Ukraine, and also on various papers that I've written, particularly about the 1920s. It's easy to juxtapose. It's easy to have one chapter on the Jews, one chapter followed by one chapter on Ukrainians, then to move to another period, have one chapter on Jews, one chapter on Ukrainians. The difficulty is to sort of combine these into one narrative, and a narrative in which both groups can recognize themselves. Why is this effort important? Well, partly because the story of Jews in Ukraine has been neglected, but also because the layering of cultures is an important. Understanding the layering of cultures is important in our century around the world. We share a planet. We are aware of the fact that different groups coexist, and that history is layered. There are multiple layers that have gone into history. I think it might be interesting for you to know, I live now, I'm originally from Britain, from England. I was born and raised in England, but I've lived in Canada most of my life. And in the north end of Winnipeg, close to where I live, the first residents there were indigenous people, Korінні народи, Indianci. Then came the Anglo-Scottish settlers. Then came the Asians, many Koreans, and now once again the area is being heavily settled again by indigenous peoples. The history of this area and of Winnipeg and of Prairie Canada can be told from various perspectives, and is told from various perspectives: Indigenous, Anglo-Scottish, Jewish, Asian, Ukrainian. Museums are being established, books published, which each tell the story of a particular group, including the Ukrainians, who have a museum, who are writing books about their group. Ukrainians played a very important role in the development of Western Canada between the 1890s and 1940s in particular. There are many mono-narratives of this nature, and in the Ukrainian mono-narrative there are many place names that are from Ukraine: streets, towns, topographical markers, buildings, churches, community halls, schools, etc. But there are also many sites that are not linked to Ukraine, but to Ukrainian-Canadian history. So the picture at the back there, I don't know if you recognize it, but this is a picture from 1971. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau came in 1971 to a Congress of the Ukrainian Canadians, an annual Congress of Ukrainian Canadians, and declared that Canada would be a multicultural country. It would recognize itself a multicultural country, the first in the world to do so. It's a bilingual country, French and English, official languages, but it would have an identity that would be multicultural. The reason why he came to the Ukrainians to make this declaration was because they had been very instrumental and very vocal in demanding this. The post-war Ukrainian community, which was, already the third or fourth generation of Ukrainians in Canada, had pushed very hard for this. So today, in the Western provinces, we have bilingual schools. By bilingual schools, we mean English and Hebrew, or English and Ukrainian, or English and German. You can do this because this is now part of the fabric of Canadian society. And throughout Canadian schools, the curriculums teach multiculturalism. They teach about Canada's many cultures, including that of Indigenous people. So the question is, how do you do this? It's not easy. It's not easy to tell the story of diversity. Very often people express fear that their community, their history, might not be presented with the sensitivity and understanding that it deserves, or that the dark moments in their history will cast them in a negative light. So I face this when dealing with Ukrainian-Jewish relations. Very often these same fears and these same difficulties of telling a story that is inclusive come to the fore. So I would like to make a few points around why I think this is difficult and how it might be overcome. The first point is to recognize that the discourse between Jews and Ukrainians, concerning Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine, has been a long one. It's already recorded in the early literature, the chronicles from 1,000 years ago, and in letters from Jewish communities from the beginning of the second millennium. It's recorded in religious polemics in the Baroque period, so-called, the 17th century. It arose forcefully in the mid-19th century when several stereotypes were created. Then it developed as part of the anti-imperial, or if you like, national liberationist movements at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. In the 1920s, the discourse contributed to the idea of creating an inclusive Ukraine, one that would allow for the development of both Yiddish and Ukrainian cultures, Ukrainian language cultures. It was a time of parallel institution building, which for many people made the idea of a Soviet Ukraine an attractive proposition, and a welcome contrast to the reality that had been the experience of Tsarist Russia, the reality of restrictions on movement and language, the ability to recognize difference, to allow for expression of identity in literature, media, education, and politics. After the 1920s, media and politics, this discourse around inclusivity fell silent. It became a discourse of exclusivity, a period of arrests, mass show trials, cultural homogenization. Then in Galicia, meanwhile in Galicia and Western Ukraine in the 30s and 40s, a discourse not of inclusivity but of exclusivity, not of integration but of separation, was shaped by political events, especially the rise of nationalisms, notably Ukrainian and Polish, which expressed antagonistic attitudes towards Jews. The discourse then shifted in the period of the dissidents in the 60s and 70s. Then the two communities played a prominent role in this period of dissent, when citizens of both Ukrainian and Jewish origin worked together to defend political prisoners, to create an awareness of human rights. And now, after 1991, a new context has shaped debates over civil society and cultural memory. I hope this brief survey indicates the length and complexity of this discourse, which might be told differently if one focuses only on one language, one aspect, one period, or one group. So the first point to make is the length, the complexity of this discourse. The second point is the presence of countercurrents. Some periods were dominated by unity, a drive for unity between, a rapprochement, if you like, between Jews and Ukrainians in the struggle for civil rights and against social injustice and chauvinism. And some moments are characterized by antagonism. But the cross currents always existed. The relationship between Jews and Ukrainians evolved in response to political and social cultural changes, which included state-sponsored anti-Semitism and anti-Ukrainianism, violent revolutionary upheavals, massive attempts at social engineering under Soviet rule, and 2 world wars. So there was a constant dialectic throughout these periods when countervailing forces worked either to separate us and them or to describe a common direction. It's worth mentioning this because even today one tends to find people who still divide us and them, who describe all Ukrainians or all Jews as always believing and acting in certain ways, which is never the case, of course. In view of these considerations, I would like to suggest that there is a need to develop new approaches, a new language, a new terminology, new conceptual schemes that can convey complexity and evolution. It's always easier to simplify. We know that simple stories drive out complex stories, especially when the simple story is endlessly repeated, like a mind-numbing advertising slogan. We need to, that's actually why we value, I think, great literature, or why we value excellent scholarship, because it's capable of capturing richness and nuance, to discover new ways of perceiving and feeling. Good literature or good scholarship resists the idea of essentializing identities, of seeing human nature as incapable of change, or forever frozen in one formation. But part of the complexity also is a problem that the past is always with us. The past weighs upon the present and influences it. This makes memory studies, for example, an important contemporary field. I know that Ukrainians like to talk about genes. I mean, G-E-N-E-S, genes, predetermined behavior and other invariables. I don't like these conversations. I tend to avoid those metaphors. So I'll offer another one, the spaceship. Although I have not traveled in space, I understand that when one ejects something from a space capsule, the object remains visible for a long time while it travels for a while along a parallel orbit. It only disappears slowly as it develops its own orbit. And in some cases, I imagine periodically it returns to the capsule again. This image can serve as a metaphor for the Jewish-Ukrainian past, which travels, is visible, it's there, it's just outside, it's sort of traveling alongside the capsule. And periodically it makes its presence felt, either as a reminder, or a warning, or an inspiration. One can never completely jettison it, one can never ignore its existence. This Ukrainian-Jewish past demands integration into the framework of Ukrainian cultural history. One has to find ways, I feel, of telling the both-and story, not the either-or story. A similar challenge is faced, it seems to me, by all states, all communities in the world. A world that is simultaneously global and local, international and national, layered by the experience brought by successive waves of immigration. Each wave, with the passage of time, identifies itself as local, national, the inhabitants, the natives. And we see this particularly strongly in a place like Canada, but in so many places around the world. So throughout this process, there have always been countercurrents. As I said, I keep discovering fascinating aspects of this. For example, I was struck by the fact that after 1919, the pogroms of 1919, the Sich riflemen, Sichovi Strelci, published plays sympathetic towards Jewish suffering, while at the same time other people were publishing plays that portrayed interaction very differently. The Sich riflemen, particularly the ones that found themselves in North America in immigration, were very aware that there was a kurin, or a company of Jews, Ternopil Jews, fought alongside the Sichovi Strelci. And the plays that the Sichovi Strelci published, like Kozy Chumanska's, Yevgeny Chirikov's, were actually produced by the veterans, the riflemen veterans, both in Western Ukraine and in North America, as expressions of solidarity with the Jewish community and an attempt to repair the damage done by the pogroms. I don't know if you know, but there is the dance impresario, the creator of Ukrainian dance on stage, Vasil Avramenko, first created his company from POWs, prisoners of war in Polish camps. In 1921, he took to the stage and developed choreographed dance as an expression of national identity. Simon Petliurat said to him, you will not make a good soldier, you can do more for the cause by presenting Ukraine on stage, which he did. He showcased Ukrainian culture by incorporating regional diversity. He worked to repair also relations with the Jewish community. I was fascinated to discover that one of his dances, called Hore Israelia, War of Israel, was first performed in Lviv and Lutsk in 1923, then became part of his repertoire. It aimed to show the suffering of Jews and Ukrainians as two oppressed, stateless people. After moving to Canada in 1925, he performed the dance throughout North America, most notably in New York's Metropolitan Opera House in 1931 and at the Chicago World Fair in 1933. Incidentally, he also danced in Jerusalem a few years before his death in the 1970s. However, at the same time as this was going on, other people were watching plays that were very disparaging of Jews. I want to quote you from the Edmonton Journal, English language publication, from January 1910. It reported on a performance of a play, Vitlejemska Nich, Bethlehem Night, by players at the St. Joseph's Church, Ukrainian Catholic Church. Readers learned that the dialogue and singing were in the Ruthenian language. This is an English language reporter, which made the entertainment more unique. The parts of the different characters were well presented, and the singing was heartily enjoyed by all present. One witness described the audience response as follows, quote, "This drama was vastly appreciated, especially by the younger fry of the community, who enjoyed seeing the devil carry a Jew off the scene with a pitchfork and cast him into hell with certitude and great vigor. The older folk considered this treatment very drastic and an unwarranted loss of useful material. Here in the North, we do not believe in killing Jews. No, nor even bank managers. Where we are not infrequently paid to the quick to provide money for real estate payments or to margin up against the bad news the ticker tape has spelled out. Yes, it would be highly unreasonable to allow the Ruthenian folk to kill off the Jews and bankers, and would make us uncommonly sorry." This is 1910, and this is an English perception of what was happening in this play. The return of the negative in the 1930s, the stereotyping of Jews once more, especially on small town stages, became a sort of a pulpit for condemning Jews. The problem for the scholar is how to include both these counter currents, frankly and honestly, to convey the view of enlightened intellectuals and of unenlightened masses, and to show the dialectic of evolution. I've always been of the view that the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians is not the way it is sometimes described as two solitudes. On the contrary, I think it's been a very intimate and close relationship, and there are many, many links. Some of these links are political. Already in the Kiev Ramada and the later 19th century, and in the Spilka party, Jews and Ukrainians collaborated. They were both part of these groups. In culture, in the theater, there were very close connections. When in 1882, Kiev's anti-Semitic and anti-Ukrainian newspaper, Kievlyanin, reviewed a performance of the Ukrainian operetta Natalka Poltavka in the city. It noted that an enormous crowd of Jews had noisily welcomed the show as though it were part of their own Yiddish experience, their own Yiddish repertoire. Among Russian nationalists, such displays of Jewish-Ukrainian solidarity fueled the fear of subversion and separatism that led to the pogroms, of course, in the 1880s and 1905, but also to the Baylis trial in 1913. But the Ukrainian and Jewish cultural history is very close. The Ukrainian troops and the Jewish troops combined, collaborated. Sadowski often used Jewish musicians. They traveled throughout Ukraine. Then in the 1920s, there was a further cooperation. All of this history has almost been lost, and it's only because of people like Yefim Melamed, who was working on this in the 1920s, and terrific scholars like Amelia Glaser, who is here, and Johanna Petrovsky-Stern, that we're beginning to rediscover these connections. It's also an economic, it was also an economic collaboration. By the 20th century's first decade, Jews had become part of Kiev's economic and social fabric. In the late 1880s, all major sugar producers, including Poles, Russians, Jews, and Ukrainians, formed a syndicate with a head office in Kiev, and this group soon controlled 90% of all granulated sugar production in the empire. The sugar barons contributed a lot to the development of Kiev. The municipal museum, known as the Museum of Antiquities and Arts, was sponsored by the Tereshchenkos, by Bogdan Khanenko, and by Lazar Brodsky, who worked together to develop charitable institutions, educational and infrastructural projects. We have Arnold Margulis, who defended Ukrainian peasants against rapacious landowners, became very popular politically, and then became part of the Ukrainian National Republic government. For many years, a diplomat in the service there. So when you work on Ukrainian-Jewish relations, I think you become very aware of a whole host of omissions, blank spots, misrepresentations, things that need reviewing. I think probably Petrovsky-Stern's book and my book appeared simultaneously from the same publisher at the same time, partly because we both sensed the need to delve into this history. Petrovsky-Stern looked at the Ukrainian voice, the Jewish voice in Ukrainian literature, analyzing figures like Pritska Nerenko, Leonid Pervomaisky, Raisa Troyanka, Ivan Kulek, Moisei Fishbane. My own interest was in how the evolution took place over time: Romanticism, realism, modernism, Soviet decades, post-independence. But also in the contribution that Ukrainians have made, Ukrainian non-Jews, if you like, non-Jewish Ukrainians, if you like, to the perception of Jews in literature. And there are many, many aspects to this, from the 19th century views, of Kostomarov, Kulish, Shevchenko, through late 19th century, very pro-Jewish writings by Pavlo Hrabovsky, Lesya Ukrainka, Alexander Oles, Mykola Bajan. Later in the century, in the 20th century, Modest Levitsky, Stepan Vasilchenko, Ahatan Krimsky, Timofey Bordulyak, the plays of Ivan Karpenko-Kary, real name Tobilevich. There's an entire history here that I felt that I had discovered that needed bringing forward. I want to tell you also that I also am interested in politics. And I've just written a book on the four revolutions over 100 years, from 1917 to 2017. And one of the chapters there is about the first Bolshevik histories of the Ukrainian Revolution. They were written by Jewish Ukrainian Bolsheviks. Ravish Cherkassky, Rafes, and they are extremely pro-Ukrainian. There's a good reason why these histories were all banned by the Bolsheviks in the mid-20s, because they show the support of the Jewish community for the Central Rada in 1917. They showed with sympathy the struggle of the Ukrainians for establishing their own, for self-determination, and they demonstrate the imperialist and colonialist mentality of Russian cadre in the Bolshevik Party. This has been buried, this history. All you have to do, though, is to pick up the histories written in 1920, 1923 by these Jewish Ukrainians. And even Dokhvili, within the Bolshevik Party, the critique written of the nationalities policy was written by a Ukrainian and a Jew. This, it's a fascinating history that really is very poorly known in the West, but I think also not that well known here. my own interest also has been in the avant-garde, and it seems to me that what the Kulturliga was doing in the 1920s was very close, the theory behind it was very close to what the Ukrainian avant-garde was doing in Kiev at the same time, Kiev and Kharkiv at the same time. That's another area of exploration that I'm following. So what I'm suggesting is to tell this story of mutual influencing and parallel development, we have to find ways of including different perspectives, of aligning similar developments. It might require bifocal or stereoscopic, if you like, approaches, or it may require presenting a multi-layered perspective. Another area is stereotypes. I think Ukrainians, I don't want to say that they're lucky, but you have fantastic material to deal with here. And it needs to be the development of stereotypes, or the development away from early stereotypes needs to be examined. Stereotypes are interesting. I mean, it's a way of simplifying, a way of reducing to one image, and over time it breaks down. We're probably all familiar with a certain paradoxical way of thinking. Stereotypes are interesting. Homi Bhabha has spoken about how a stereotype combines opposites. It needs to be able to sort of define and categorize and dismiss. They, whoever the other might be, are rich and hide their wealth, or conversely, they are poor and grasping. They keep themselves separate and refuse to participate in the life of the broader community, or they weasel their way into every social group. They refuse to support our political causes, or they place themselves among the leaders of our movement, our political cause. They are better dressed and better heeled than us, or they are dirty and scruffy. So, you can see how these opposites combine to encompass every possible nuance. At the root of this way of thinking is a desire to discover an ontology, an essential characteristic that applies in all cases and times. A refusal to deal with conjunctural factors, which are frequently much more important. Perhaps why the stereotype requires this range of options. Ukrainians are familiar with this logic, though, because their own portrayal today and in recent years in the Russian media shows them exactly how this stereotype works. The Russian media at the time of the Euromaidan defined Ukrainians as being nationalists, or at the same time as having no nationalist feelings, since they really, deep down inside, considered themselves to be Russian. Russian commentators have characterized Ukrainians over the years as treacherous and subversive anti-Russianism, a charge that has been thrown against anyone who opposes Moscow. Mazepa, there are Mazepites, they've been called, or Hrushevsky, or Petlura, or Bandera, or Poroshenko. But simultaneously they have been characterized as Russia's loyal and grateful subordinates, a lesser tribe that nonetheless knew they were part of the great Russian scene, or the great Russian sea. They're criticized as refusing to share a linguistic space with Russia, and at the same time as desiring to be part of the Ruski Mir. They are portrayed as, in the Russian media, as anti-Semitic and xenophobic. At the same time, they're being portrayed as run by Jewish parliamentarians and oligarchs. Their government is a Nazi-fascist junta, and simultaneously a product of European, gay-loving liberals and Democrats. I mean, all these things somehow in people's minds combine, completely opposites, combine to create this sort of way of cataloging and classifying, simplifying and naming, all in order to dismiss. After you become aware of these options available to the stereotype, you can begin to de-ontologize peoples and cultural phenomena to avoid this pattern of reductionist thinking. I think over time, in the last 200 years, I've looked at this process of stereotypes and falling apart of stereotypes, and I think one of the stories to tell about the perception of Jews, the discourse of Jewish-Ukrainian relations, is the collapse of the stereotype. It's essentially disappeared now, and it's funny, even funny to read about how people stereotyped Jews in the past. Why is this all important today? Well, first of all, it's a good time for a reassessment of the cultural past and of future perspectives. Ukraine today is an international issue, and Ukrainian-Jewish relations an international topic of considerable newsworthiness. Even a few decades ago, even maybe 15 years ago, some discussions would not have been possible, either because of inertia, the labeling of everything Ukrainian as Russian, the dominance in the West of Russian studies. I mean, there's very few places where Ukrainian was taught, maybe a little more now, and the refusal to understand that Russian also meant often Ukrainian. Russian Empire included Ukraine. But also, there's the case in some circles of prejudices caused by ignorance and fear. However, the commitment to a democratic, socially progressive, and more open society has united most communities in Ukraine and has drawn them together. In this respect, the country and society has much to teach other communities, including those in the West, who now struggle with rising levels of intolerance, the stereotyping of minorities as irredeemable, and calls for the erection of barriers or the expulsion of groups perceived to be different. Ukrainian history has seen all this before, and contemporary Ukrainian-Jewish rapprochement has therefore allowed for a rethinking of Ukraine's own history, but also a new way of perceiving East European history as a whole. I don't want to underestimate the difficulties, because there are many things, many aspects of history that require attention, and many contemporary problems that still require attention. We tend to look at history through certain flashpoints, and different communities see these differently. The historical flashpoints most frequently referred to by Jewish commentators are often not the same as those that are drawn attention to by Ukrainians. If one thinks of history as a tapestry or a series of tableaus, a sequence most commonly remembered by Jews differs from the one remembered by Ukrainians. But you have to understand and analyze the way of thinking of both groups. Sometimes you have to demythologize some figures and some narrative lines. There are endless numbers of questions that still need analysis. So I'm aware of these inherited schemes in people's heads, and I try to sort of undermine them or make them more complicated. That's sort of the purpose of my book. I looked at Romantic nationalism. I looked at the modernist period, which was very pro-Jewish in Ukrainian literature, the 1920s, the 1930s, the dissidents. But I want to end with the Euromaidan. I think the Euromaidan has been, I think you all recognize this, has been extremely important. The return of the past occurred in a big way. And there's been a decisive move towards building a civil society, an inclusive civil society. At this time, a lot of people of Ukrainian citizens of Jewish ancestry became very prominent. We have Vitaly Portnikov, journalist and commentator, Alexander Reutberg, Matvey Weisberg, who became prominent figures in art, in the cultural field, in expressing a Jewish Ukrainian identity, and were very strongly attacked by people who felt that they're escaping the stereotype. They're linking up with Ukrainians. This is very fearful to certain, particularly Russian commentators, who have a very limited understanding of how you can be both at the same time, Ukrainian and Jewish. And of course, we have Prime Minister Volodymyr Groysman and President Volodymyr Zelensky. All of these are interesting ways of challenging the age-old stereotypes and the ways, the calcified ways of thinking. And also, I don't need to repeat this, but there's a study of Jewish history that has been stimulated by the Euromaidan, development of museums, of exhibitions, of cultural events, and a new literature, from Marina Hrymich's books to Andruchowicz's, to Yeshkilev's, to Irvanetsy's, to Boris Khersonsky, who was mentioned yesterday, and so on. Now, we can talk about obstacles, and there are plenty of obstacles, and I can certainly go into detail about them. But perhaps it'd be more interesting for you if I ended with just some images, kind of illustrating what I was talking about. This I've spoken about. This is a photo of Ukrainians raising money for war bonds, 1940. They, for the war effort against Nazi Germany. They were not the communist community, because at that time the communist community was opposed to Canada going to war. The communist community, the communist Ukrainians and the communist community, which was large, very large, had been given instructions that they should not support the capitalist war. The Soviet Union was allied to Germany at the time. Winnipeg's North End, the Ukrainians and Jews were very close, very much connected in Winnipeg's North End. There were two large communities. In fact, I don't know if this is true, but I've been told that there is a Winnipeg Yiddish accent. There was a Montreal Yiddish accent, New York Yiddish accent, but there's always a Winnipeg accent. And there's a very well-known, very famous photographer, Ivan Paskevich, who, his films are online, his documentary films, you can see them online, or at least some of them. And he photographed the North End in the 1970s as the Jewish community was moving out and the Ukrainian community was moving out and other communities were moving in. He was photographing what was there. This is Ted Baryuk's grocery store. Can you tell which of these people are Jewish and which are Ukrainian?
It's stereotypical, to judge.
Well, that's the whole point. It's almost impossible to tell. This chap is a Jew who regularly came to Ted Baryuk's grocery store because he supplied them with sweets, candies, as they are known in North America. This lady is Jewish, and so is he. These were the Jewish stores. This is what people looked like in the 1970s. Are they that much different from the way Ukrainians look? All these are side by side. This is a Ukrainian woman in her store. This is a lady selling pierogis, as we call them, vareniki. And here's a Ukrainian tailor. Here's a Ukrainian barber and a Ukrainian shoemaker. Could be any nationality, right? It's very East European looking. You have a Jewish synagogue, one of the oldest, and actually built in the tradition of Ukrainian synagogues with the balcony upstairs and the same decorations. And this is the Ukrainian Communist Hall. Ukrainsky Робітничий дім. But it gets more complicated. Who are these people? These are Métis. There is a nation called the Métis, originally formed from the mixture of French settlers with Indians and Irish, originally French speaking. They are now, or they were in the North End, they still are in the North End. Today you have the return of the the native community, the Aboriginal community, living side by side with all these others. We have Hutterites, colonies of Hutterites, German speaking, who enter the city. What nationality are these boys? Well, actually, they're Ukrainian. What nationality is this person? Well, actually, he's Ukrainian. What nationality is the old guy there? 1971. Well, he's Ukrainian. And this is John Pleskevich's sister working in the store that they own. And these people here are Knights of Columbus, a very Roman Catholic kind of order, but part of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And here they are marching, but the mural is Ukraine. So, it's a very interesting combination of images. And for the life of me, I couldn't tell you who these people are. They could be anybody. They could be a mixture of groups. So this is very much Ukraine. These are the people who, on the 5th of December 1917, were the founders of the Ukrainian Academy of Art. And you have Avram Manevich seated on the far left, who was always a great defender and a great popularizer of Ukrainian art, who then sent from North America, he sent his art to Ukraine. But you also have Vasyl Krichevsky and Fedor Krichevsky, whose father was Jewish. And Vasyl Krichevsky emigrated, but his brother remained, and he was never outed during the German occupation. These are stories, I think, that are worth telling. Obviously, this is the Jewish banknotes. Here are the Sichevi Strelci. I found this photograph. They're burying a comrade who is obviously Jewish. Look at the inscription. This is the Ukrainian soldiers. It was a far more intimate relationship, as I've said before. And here is a poster of Avramenko, Vasily Avramenko, his ballet appearing in North America. This stuff has been so badly damaged, or so heavily buried, that it's only now coming to life. And here are some plays. A translation of Gordin into Ukrainian, a Yiddish play. Here is a very pro-Jewish play that was produced, and here is a very anti-Jewish play. I sometimes read a passage from there just to shock people.
Could you read it loud because it's not seen at the back? It's very small.
Could I read what?
The title.
The
title.
Okay, well, this one here is Siritka Chasya by Gordin. Yeah, Gordin. Right? This is Lviv, 1924. This is Kozich Umanska, which is a pseudonym for Isaac Chanin, I think. Pimsta Zhidivke, New York, I think 1924. And this is Hadus, some minor West Ukrainian Galician writer, У кожного розум є, як горівки він доп'є. So this is 1929 Lviv. But as you get further into the 30s, you get more of this, especially in Western Ukraine, you get more of this anti-Semitic writing. And of course, you must know this. These are the plays, the Jewish plays that were produced in Ukraine. A lot of them. Some of them in Ukrainian, some of them in Russian, some of them in Yiddish. These posters are from the theater museum on the territory of the Lavra. It is a fascinating large history here to tell. And books produced by the Vaad group, the translations into Yiddish of Ukrainian authors and vice versa. And also I mentioned, I don't want to show any more slides, but I also wanted to mention the similarity in the avant-garde between what Ukrainians were doing with what Jews were doing. I should also, because I've studied the Wojciech group, the avant-garde of the 1920s. In fact, I've just published a book on the avant-garde in Ukraine in the 1920s. And I might mention that 1/3 of the Wojciech group were Jews. And they worked on Jewish themes. So again, another example of the intimacy of this relationship. In immigration, I think one tends to write mono-ethnic histories. We need to sort of get away from that, and that's been the point of my lecture, is to sort of find ways of telling a complex weave and describing an interrelationship that we've almost forgotten about. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Please, your questions, comments. Please,
Thank you for your public talk. I think this public talk would be also very needed, necessary for the wider audience, and I hope someone will look at, because in this room, in this audience, I'm sure all the researchers and from various fields who are gathered, they usually understand what you are speaking about, including and not stereotypizing, and this change in approaches. It's slowly, but it's being done, and it's owing to intellectuals who speak to people and younger generation of writers or artists who are changing their views on identity, not only by blood or religion, but some other kinds of identities. I'm interested, how is it going on in Canada? Like you spoke about multiculturalism, which was announced and recognized by state, and you spoke about schools. How Canadian pupils, school youngsters, and universities, how do they present literature? Is it literature and art as a field, and you just studied? Is it Canadian literature? Because in Ukraine, I'm still thinking that what we do not have to bring this dialogue more public, we don't have inclusion about those figures which I concern should be studied either in whole literature or in the field of Ukrainian literature. Because Ukrainian literature, is it only about the language, or is it about the feeling of person living here and writing, like Sholem Aleichem, Gogol, plenty of other figures worked here and wrote about this reality. It's not included in Ukrainian literature, even if the books are published now in new series, new translations. You would get Голоси Европы, Voices of Europe, or bestsellers of European literature, and here you get caveat. And it's complexity. In contemporary literature, I do not know, fiction, I mean, if you read it, there are Jews more often being met in Ukrainian literature, but still you get plenty of stereotypes, or you include Jews like a part of landscape, and they are there because they're part of landscape. I mean, Василь Шкляр, his Черный Ворон, where you meet a Jewish girl in sexual contest, just for that, and she's described, or some other contemporary figures. You meet even Jews in Winnichuk's writings. I don't speak about high fiction, but that's what is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, that's a fascinating subject, and it might be worthwhile actually having a conference to compare, to discuss, you know, what Canada's experience has been in education. It's not all easy. It's not all simple in Canada, but my children, my two girls, went through Canadian schools, and they do have units in which they discuss the Canadian identity, and they include units about Indigenous peoples. There is a unit about the Holodomor, about the suffering of Ukrainians in the 1930s. There are, you know, separate units which introduced people to different groups, and these are known as Canadians. There's a reason why we hyphenate Ukrainian Canadians, German Canadians, French Canadians, Jewish Canadians. And they're hyphenated identities, but they're all Canadians, and that's very important. Initially, I'm not very satisfied with the multiculturalism in Canada, because I always feel it's a bit tokenish. It's a token, you know. We have labels, and politicians feel good, you know, because they feel that they're supporting multiculturalism. The money they give for multiculturalism is very small, but because officially it is recognized as a multicultural country, and because in the educational system this is a fact, it does have a big effect. Children grow up being very accepting. It's normal in Canada to ask, oh, you know, where are your parents from? Or what kind of Canadian are you? You know, it's normal to be different and be Canadian at the same time. So in that respect, it's a very positive thing. It's an attitude thing. You know, people are proud to be Indigenous or Ukrainian or Jewish or German. There's nothing wrong with it. It's interesting, you know. So I think that's a big plus. But there is a rollback. I talked about countercurrents. There is now a countercurrent against this. There's an anti-multicultural move, particularly in the Republican Party in the States, and in the Conservative Party in Canada. I don't consider this a conservative party. I think it should be called a right-wing party. The right wing is moving to an extreme stance, and these people are extremely opposed not only to immigration, they're opposed to multiculturalism, multicultural attitudes, accepting, inclusive attitudes. So there are many problems. However, I think there's also a great deal that you can learn from this experience, and it's become part of the mainstream. It's, you know, people are deeply committed to this across Canada. One of the things that make Canada different from many places in the United States, although Amelia will probably be better able to tell us what's going on in the United States in this area.
We need another conference around table on this.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating subject.
Okay, back to the subject. So more comments or
I actually have a question concerning Bolshevists. You have mentioned that there were about 30% of Jewish artists in the Bolsheviks group. And I've just recalled that I read deciphered the interviews with Olga Palimarkish, who was in an account by Yenisei, not that far in north, but about that. And among the people, among that Ukrainian, so to speak, part of that camp, there was at least one Bolshevist. who wasn't shot to death, who was just sentenced to like 10 years or something. And do you know about those surviving Bolsheviks of Jewish origin who were not sentenced to death?
No, I don't know particularly about them. You'd have to research each one. The book that I tried to write, which never got published, well, I finished it actually, in collaboration with people in Kiev, listed about 55 people who either considered themselves Bolshevikists or are considered Bolshevikists. And very quickly I did an estimate. About 1/3 of them were Jews or Jewish origin. I'm actually not aware of how many of those survived camps or what happened to them. That requires a more in-depth study. But I can say that the works, what they worked on, thematically and even stylistically, what they worked on was very Jewish. There was no problem with the idea of, you do your thing. It was sort of finding the roots, and for the Jewish community, it was looking to their roots, what they found inspiring, and for many Ukrainians, it was looking to their past. It was a very varied experience.
Thank you. More? It's Stefan.
Yes, I'm wondering when your book will be published.
Which book?
The one that looks at the four revolutions.
It's in my bag. I brought a copy for the organizers. It has just appeared.
Just appeared.
Just appeared. Yeah, I can still smell the ink.
And available then to order
Yes.
online then.
Yes.
Yes.
Amelia.
Yeah, thank you. This is wonderful. The Vaad writers that were commissioning translations, doing translations from Yiddish, were they also talking about conversations about Soviet Yiddish literature and the meaning of that? Or have you found any discussions in Ukrainian about the future of Yiddish literature? I'm just curious because of...
No, I have not, but the person behind you, the Yefim, is working on this, and he's the expert. He's the expert, and he's digging through, looking for all this. Actually, we're planning to help one another find materials.
We'll collaborate.
Good. We will have a good conversation in a few minutes. One more, if I can follow up with one more question about the sort of contemporary rapprochement, because I really appreciate. I absolutely 100% agree with what you're saying about since the Maidan. It's something I'm now interested in turning to. The fact that there's this idea of redefining what it means to be Ukrainian. Is it more difficult in Canada? And I am coming from a very different context in the United States. Canada is such a particular diaspora example and a kind of incubator for ideas, but not always in sync with the way things, the timing in which things happen in Ukraine itself.
Is what very different?
I guess we're seeing a kind of rapprochement between, I think, Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine. I think most of us have kind of observed that in the last 5 years. Do you feel like Canada is keeping up? Not keeping up?
That's an interesting question.
It's
a very interesting question. I would say that Ukrainians, because they travel, because they are concerned with Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine has greatly influenced them. And they are more, they have bought into this idea of a civic society. However, I think some Jews in Canada do not understand how much Ukraine has changed and how the Ukrainian community has changed. So when I speak to Jews, sometimes there's this, you immediately realize their image of Ukrainians has not caught up, has not changed. And they're a bit confused when you talk to them about Jewish Ukrainians, Ukrainian Jews, this sort of strange world where it's one civil society. They're not quite sure about that. And I think part of that is because of the propaganda that they sometimes face. So I would say that it's the Ukrainian community, for example, has gone a long way since the Euromaidan. These are Whiteford. But look at this. These are Ukrainians. Andy Warhol, Taras Shevchenko. These are Ukrainians, you know, Japanese samurai. That's Lenin. That's Putin. Putin and Lenin, right? You know, so he mixes things up. This is an unpublished volume of a story by Moshe Fishbane, which I'm hoping to sell to publish, which a Ukrainian in the West illustrated. So I think there's this sort of strange crossover. We're living through a very interesting period where explorations are taking place and a new kind of identity is being created. And I think Ukrainians in the West are aware of this. They're closer to what's happening in Ukraine. But some other communities are still, well, it depends what news you're watching. You know, if you're watching Fox News, you're going to get a very different view.
I guess we need to finish the session. Thank you so much, Myroslav.
Thank you.